Hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Johnson here in the Department of Computer Science. I'm the Career Development Lead, and today I'm going to be walking you through the tech resume and what to look out for when creating your own. And just bear with me as I'm recording this from home, so if my dog barks or you hear a strange noise, just please try to ignore it. Thanks. All right, so our agenda. So basically, we're going to just run through a tech resume format and what to look out for, general information and tips, and what are the core elements of a tech resume and any additional information that you should be mindful of when creating your own or reviewing someone else if you're a student ambassadors. So what makes a tech resume different than a normal one? Let's say one for a business student or one for a psychology major, for example. Well, it really matters. And the biggest difference is in the fact that a tech resume is going to showcase more of what we call hard skills, which are skills that are tangible and they are things that you can actually display in an interview and that you can show in person or in front of someone in an interview. So these are going to be things like programming languages such as Python, Java, and it can be tools and frameworks, operating systems, and just really strong analytical and quantitative abilities and knowledge. So when you're creating your own, you want to make sure that you're really focusing on what I can show for myself and the work that I've done, and then also how do I measure the success that I've done. But we'll get to that in just a couple of minutes in the next part of the presentation. All right, so some general tips. So for those of you that aren't aware, a recruiter, if it even makes it to the eyes of a recruiter, a resume will be viewed around 10 to 20 seconds before before a recruiter makes a decision about whether or not they want to move forward with this person. Now, that can feel a little bit daunting because of the fact that you have probably spent way more than that in creating your document, but that just means that your information should be concise, it should be clear, and it should be nice and easily legible, and it should be able to be read in a very quick manner. So you want to make sure that you really focus on the things that you want a technical recruiter to see first. And that means that you should probably keep it to one page, particularly if you're an undergrad. Now, if you're a grad student or you have industry experience from either tech or other industries and you're coming in as a student, then you can probably get away with 2 pages. But in general, if you're an undergrad, unless you have done an extensive amount of internships, or you've done a lot of projects, you've been really, really involved on campus, I always recommend keeping it to 1 page. And that's pretty unanimous across most tech companies. They will say the same because of the fact that they spend such a small amount of time looking at your document. Now, there's no one correct way or a specific way to create a resume. It's a very subjective document. So that means that there's not like one particular format that you have to follow. But for tech, there are definitely sections that you want to make sure that you cover within your document. All right, one thing that we need to bring up that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of is what we call an ATS, or applicant tracking system. Now, this is a software system that is used by particularly large companies such as Google, Amazon, et cetera, that will literally have the computer scan your resume and to see if there is enough overlap between your document and what the job is asking. So the reason that this is on here is because of the fact that you really need to make sure that your resume or whoever's resume you're reviewing has enough overlap in the text and in the skills that are being asked of you that are going to be the same as what is asking in the job description. So if a job is asking a lot for you to know a lot of Java or Python, make sure that you have that included at least 2 or 3 times throughout your document. The ATS is a very big hurdle for getting hired, particularly, like I said, at those big 5s or FANG companies. So you really want to outsmart it and beat it if you can. So I just always recommend not having a lot of crazy graphics or anything like a photo, just because that will throw off the entire algorithm and you don't want your application to be passed up. And it can also be helpful. You're like, well, where do I begin? Well, it can be really helpful to sit down and write a list of your skills and accomplishments just to get started. And that can be something, if you're a first year, second year student, you can include high school. There is nothing wrong with that. But if you are a junior or senior or graduate student, you don't really want to include high school because that's not new information as much anymore. So when you're trying to figure out where to begin, it can be very helpful to just sit down and figure out, well, this is what I did as a president of this club. This is what I've done as a student in this organization. And that'll just help you kind of figure out how to categorize everything and to get all of it onto text. All right, so we talked about how to begin and how long someone's going to look at your resume. So what are the core elements? So the general outline is you're going to have your header that has your contact information, that has your phone number, email, etc. We'll get to that in a second, what should be included. You can have an optional objective statement. We'll get to that. Education, skills, projects, they can be class or personal or hackathons. Experience, so it doesn't have to be directly relevant, and then any additional experience or extracurricular activities. All right, so what should be included in your header? Well, you definitely need to have your name, city and state, your phone number, and then also your email, the one that you check most often. And then, so what's optional? Well, it's optional, but it is strongly recommended to have your LinkedIn and or your GitHub, because particularly if you're looking at software engineering jobs and you have code on your GitHub, this is a great way for a senior engineer, not a recruiter, but a senior engineer who's looking at your documents, if you make it past the first round, to see what kind of code you've written. And then your LinkedIn is just great because that's how they can find you online. And you can also connect with these recruiters via LinkedIn and be able to get connected that way and still maintain contact. So I always recommend including a LinkedIn, particularly if you are a sophomore or above, just because you're going to be looking for those internships. And you just want to make sure that you have it in your header and that it's customized. And we have a whole separate part of our website that focuses on LinkedIn. So if you want to look there, you can. All right, so education and skills. So as students, this is going to be the next section in your document, unless you are a student who has worked in industry before and you're coming back for a degree. That's the only exception here. So education, of course, you want to list your degree type, you want to list your major minors, where you graduated. And one thing I want to mention is when you're writing a resume, the dates go on the right-hand side of the document and the content goes on the left, typically, kind of like this example is laid out here. Things that are optional. So if your GPA is 3.0 or higher, whether it's cumulative or your major, you should include it. You also want to list any honors, any relevant courses. So yeah, don't put like comp, 110, you want to put intro to programming, et cetera. And that is going to be how you would list this particular section here. If you are a student who is maybe newer to the major or doesn't have quite as much internship or project experience, the relevant courses can be a great addition because they showcase your knowledge without it being in action quite yet. So that's your education section. If you were a member of the Honors College, you will list that here. If you were a Robertson Scholar, you will list that here. This is where that information is going to go unless you want to create a whole new section. I typically recommend creating a new section when you have 2 or more honors that you want to list. All right. So skills. If I had to pick one particular section of a tech resume that you really need to make sure you have fleshed out, it is this one, because this is what I mentioned earlier, talking about those hard skills. These are tangible, teachable, and measurable things. So things like good communicator or effective team leader, those are fine if you have management experience, but right now as students or as someone who's recently graduating or graduated, you're probably going to just want to focus more on those hard skills that you can showcase in your next job. So for all computer science majors, or for a lot of comp sci majors, this is going to be things like programming languages, operating systems, certification. So if you have a certification in cybersecurity or something along those lines, this is where you will list that. And then foreign languages. So let's say you speak Spanish or you speak Portuguese or something. This is where you want to list that. And you can also indicate proficiency. So you can indicate proficiency in languages, whether that's like a technical language, such as Java, or whether that is a foreign language, such as Spanish, like I mentioned. You could indicate fluency, etc. So we talked about education, we talked about skills, now we're going to talk about projects. So I want to mention, this is not in any strict order. The only order I would strongly recommend using is having education first and then skills, But after this is where we kind of begin to have this is where it becomes a very subjective document in terms of what's most relevant. That's what you're going to list next. So if those are your projects, particularly students who might not have that internship experience yet, the project section is an extremely important element of a tech resume. So this is an employer favorite. I put that on here because out of all the recruiters I've ever spoken with, almost every single one of them says that this is a section they love reading, and it's a section they could recommend a candidate moving forward with because it showcases your skill set. I do want to strongly emphasize that it does not have to be something that is like it doesn't have to be a personal project. It could be one from a course. It could be one from a hackathon, but it's an area to showcase your coding abilities as well as your technical skills in action. So we mentioned the tech skills up top, but now we get to see them in action. So this is why I love the project section, because it's a great way to really showcase what you've done. And how do we format it? So as you see to the right, a typical format, you don't have to follow it, but a suggested format is to name the project first, and then also where you did it at. So Pearl Hacks, whether that was a course, whether it's web programming that you did it in, this is where you list it to the right side. And then all the way over is where you list the name of the date of the project. And then beneath that, you're going to list what you did and what your particular role was within the project itself. And I always say here, quantify as much as you can, because of the fact that this is a very crucial section, and companies like to see productivity, right? So just make sure that if you wrote, hundreds or thousands of lines of code, you mention it. And I also suggest putting programming languages in bold, because that's a great way to have the reader's eye be attracted to it, and they can see what you've done in action. All right, so next we have experience. So this can be listed as relevant experience, work experience, professional experience. It does not really matter. Each person's resume is going to be different. So you can also list things like teaching and research experience here if it's related to computer science or tech. Let's say, for example, if you were a grad assistant in the department of, if you were a grad assistant in history, you might not list this here unless you were using hard or your technical skills. Otherwise, it becomes more of like additional experience. But if it was something like, let's say, for example, that you were you were doing database migration for the medical school or something, this is where you'd list it. Or if you were a comp, 411 LA, this is where you could list it. So how do you format it? Well, this is where you really want to be very intentional, because, as an employer is reading, they're going to read it quickly, like I said. So you want to make sure you have these key pieces of information. So you'll have the position title, you'll have the name of the company and the organization, you'll have the date to the far right, like we've talked about all along. And then beneath that, you will begin each bullet point with those actions and verbs that illustrate and convey leadership or your ability to finish a project or a task that you're given. So for tech, these are going to be things like deployed. These will be things like developed, created. We call them action verbs because they are showing your skills in action. It literally is what that means. And then, so what's optional? Well, so it really depends on your preference. If you're working for a company that has multiple offices, you might want to indicate the city and state. I typically always recommend putting city and state, but some students don't really feel like it's necessary, but it's up to you. I recommend it. Specific amounts. So if you happen to increase proficiency of something, you happen to save a company money, these are what things that employers want to see. So if you have done this in your role in any way, shape, or form, you want to illustrate that here, just like you did with the project section. So just make sure that you list that information in this experience portion of your resume, because that is something that employers do love to see. And again, as you can see here, this particular student bolded their their programming languages here so that they're able to have the reader see them when they first look at the document. All right, so I mentioned this additional experience that I keep referring back to, or extracurricular activities. So this is an optional section. It is not one that you have to have, but a lot of students need it because all of you do a lot, and it's hard to just showcase your one specific section of experience. But this is a place to include things like retail jobs or anything that is not directly relevant to computer science or tech. So let's say you worked at Starbucks as a barista over the summer. This is where you want to list that information. And a lot of students are under the impression that employers don't care about that, but it's actually not true because they like to see that you can A, work in a professional environment, B, that you can work with the public, C, that you have communication skills and you have time management, et cetera. So please make sure to list that here in this section if you have room on your resume. So this is a great place to show those, excuse me, to show those soft skills that I was referring to earlier. So like communication, creativity, team leadership. This is a great place to list that information because, like I said earlier, the focus up until now has kind of been on those harder tech skills, but now we're shifting a little bit more to the softer and more, I would say more of like the traditional, like, softer skills that really are still important to a candidate, but they're not necessarily what the company is prioritizing first and foremost, particularly in the tech world. So if you're a first or second year student, this is a common section because you might have had a high school job. You might have had something that you did this past summer when you're coming before you came back to UNC. And this is just a great way to showcase those summer jobs and or things that you might have done prior to coming to UNC. So extracurricular involvement, this can be written as campus and community involvement, leadership experience. So let's say, for example, you are the artistic director of Pearl Hacks, or marketing manager or director, et cetera. This is where you want to list that. Any club leaderships should go in this section. Some students will put that under their regular experience. That's fine too. But if you have internship experience, I recommend keeping that separate from any club leadership. So hackathons, if you happen to be a volunteer sometime for Hack and See or CDC, this is where you would list that information. Any volunteer work, so let's say you work for Habitat for Humanity or the Humane Society, et cetera, this is where you want to list that experience at. And then if you work for UNC in some capacity, or you volunteer, excuse me, for UNC in some capacity, and you might be, working or part of a dance club or some type of choir, et cetera, this is where you want to list that information, or if you're a member of the band, et cetera. So we talked about the core elements and the core sections. Well, we kind of ran through them, but now let's focus more on additional tips and things you need to watch out for when creating your document. So the most recent things should always come first. So we call this reverse chronological order. So anytime that you're trying to figure out how to list things, look at the dates. So May 2021 will always come before June 2020. And this is just how you want to write that on the resume because employers want to see what you've done most recently. Don't write references available upon request. That's something that was kind of, it was more popular back in maybe the 90s and early 2000s, but now we don't really do that anymore. Don't use personal pronouns. This is a very professional document. So nothing I, we, me, my. You just want to make sure it's always spoken in third person, even if it's about yourself. So if you're writing that objective statement, make sure that you're talking about, you're listing things like driven computer science major, not saying that I am a driven computer science major. You just want to make sure you leave that particular phrasing out. So don't list your personal information like birthdays, age, don't put a photo. I always recommend asking at least 2 people for feedback, whether that's me and somebody else, or whether that's a fellow classmate, someone that you would trust to look at your document and give you, helpful information that might improve it a little bit. And one thing that you should always do, and I can't stress this enough, is to tailor your resume to the jobs that you apply for. So let's say, for example, you're applying to a product management internship and you're also applying to a full stack software engineering internship. That document's probably going to look a little different for both because one might be focused more on your coding abilities and the other one might be more focused on your overall technical knowledge and acumen and also your project management experience, et cetera. And for formatting, so I always typically suggest having 1/2 inch to 1 inch margins. That way it doesn't look, it looks, the document just flows better and it just looks more professional and clean. If we're printing, that doesn't really count as much anymore because of the fact that we are not having in-person career fairs right now. But if we do get to that point again, just make sure you use thicker paper. A lot of companies have moved away from this and they'll just scan your LinkedIn and they'll find your content that way. But in the event, the rare event that we'll have to print something, make sure it's thick paper. So be consistent with the layout. So all of the content on your resume should have a period after it, after each sentence, or have none at all. So make sure everything is consistent. Make sure all of the headers are the same. Make sure your header up top looks clean and fresh, but everything should be consistent no matter what. Font should be no smaller than 11 or 12 point. 10.5 is the smallest I'd recommend, just because of the fact that you don't want someone to be squinting when they're reading your document. So some people will tell you paragraphs are fine. I don't typically recommend paragraphs on a resume because a lot of tech recruiters say the same. And I think also it's just not as easy to read. So you want your bullet points to be clean and concise, no more than 2 lines each. And if you're using colors, don't use more than 2. Simple can be better because of that applicant tracking system that I was mentioning earlier. You want the document to be easy to read because a computer, the ATS will automatically kick you out if it notices anything that it can't process. So just make sure that it doesn't have to be dry and necessarily all, the standard Times New Roman, black and white, but I don't suggest putting more than 2 colors just because it can be overwhelming, and keep it simple because you don't want the ATS to kick you out. So these are some samples. So you see that the one on the left is more of that traditional, black and white, kind of that more typical resume format that we see. If a student is interested in things like investment banking, or fintech, or anything that is more business oriented or more of the financial side of tech, they're going to want to use this one because it's not as creative of an industry. However, the one on the right is the format that was used for a student who got hired at Facebook as a software engineer, and the recruiter absolutely loved it and even sent out a note to myself and to the students saying that this was one of the reasons that they hired her in the first place, because of how much they loved her resume. So there are more than 2 colors here, but it's more nuanced. It's not like it's, a complete rainbow. It's something that the ATS could still easily read, and apparently did, because she got hired. So, you can use either or. It doesn't really matter. These are just 2 samples. You don't have to follow either of them, but it kind of gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. Make sure the lines are clean. Make sure that there's enough space between the text. Make sure that you have your skills easily readable. And this is just something, these are 2 that you could look at, but you don't have to necessarily abide by. So what are some additional resources? So as you see here, DICE is it's a tech career website. It has both postings and career resources in general. So it might have articles about what the biggest trends in tech are, but it also has a ton of information about tech resumes. I included the Google student logo here because that is something that I do love. Google's student website. I think it's very well laid out and they have a lot of helpful information about text. Monster is another one that a lot of you have probably heard of. Vault is actually something that we have here at UNC, which has examples of cover letters, which you don't really need as much in tech, but they have resumes, they have examples of what one could look like. And the computerscience.org also has a lot of helpful career and tech resume resources too. And if any of you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me at careers@cs.unc.edu, and I am happy to help. But thank all of you for being here and for watching this presentation, and I wish you the best of luck in creating your resume.